of the things that sparked the Protestant Reformation was the rediscovery of Paul's doctrine of justification.
Right, by faith alone.
By faith alone. And this was radical. This shook European society because Roman Catholicism had taught that you need faith plus works to be saved. And Luther saw in Paul that no, we're justified by faith apart from works.
Right.
But one of the things that people always come back with is, well, what do you do with James 2, where he says that Abraham was justified by works?
Well, I think we need to understand it in context.
Really? Okay, well, let's try to do that.
Let's see what we can do.
So in 2:21, this is the verse where James talks about that. He says, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect? And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. What's interesting about this verse is that some people read it almost as a counterpoint to Paul. It's as if James is directly contradicting what Paul is saying, or maybe that Paul is directly contradicting what James is saying, depending on who wrote first. But what do you make about that?
Well, first of all, you see the same exact teaching in Paul in Romans 4:1-2, and we can take a look at that.
All right, let's look at that. Romans 4:1-2, and this is, I think, a kind of a key to unlocking this dispute. Paul says, what then shall we say that Abraham our father has found according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. So it sounds like Paul is admitting that there is a justification by works, but it's not before God.
It's before men. And by the way, the word justification often carries the sense of vindication. For example, Jesus says wisdom is justified by her children.
Right.
That means wisdom is vindicated by the fruit of wisdom, by what flows from wisdom. And the same thing here. If Abraham was vindicated by works, he has something to boast about. That is before men. Did you know that Abraham, in his works, what James is talking about in James chapter 2 and verse 21 is Abraham offering up Isaac in Genesis chapter 22.
Yeah.
Which was over 25 years after he was justified by faith in Genesis 15:6.
So that's a great point. So Paul and James, they're both appealing to Abraham, but they're pointing to different points in their life. For Paul, he's pointing to that earlier time where Abraham simply believes the promise that he'd have all these descendants, but especially the Messiah.
Right.
And he's justified by faith. It's imputed to him. His faith righteousness is imputed to his faith apart from works.
Right.
But then 25 years later, or a little over 25 years later, he has this test about sacrificing the promised son that he finally has. And he's about to go through with it, and an angel stops him.
Right.
And that's the point that James uses.
Right.
And so he's saying there's a second kind of justification. There's this vindication.
Right. And in Judaism, Abraham was vindicated.
Right.
In Christianity, Abraham was vindicated.
Right.
In Islam, Abraham was vindicated.
Right.
In all three of the major religions of the world, Abraham is considered a friend of God.
Right.
And God himself, in the book of James and elsewhere in the Old Testament, calls Abraham a friend of God.
Right.
Why? Because he gave up his only begotten son, which, by the way, was a type of Christ.
Right.
Genesis 22 is the type of God the Father offering up his only begotten son. So the point here is that Abraham was vindicated by works when he offered up Isaac, and that faith was working together with his works, and the faith that he had in Genesis 15:6 was brought to maturity when he offered up his son.
So the New King James says it was made perfect. So that recognizes it already existed.
Right.
But now it's been made perfect, and you're saying that's being made mature.
Right. And notice verse 24, which we haven't read yet. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith only. That's a bad translation. Almost all translations say not by faith only, but the word there, translated only, is monon, which is an adverb. And it should say, you see then that a man is justified by works and not only by faith.
So there's a second kind of
There are
justification.
two justifications, before God by faith, before men by works.
Right. So to put it simply, this doesn't contradict Paul. Basically, it points to another kind of justification by works. It's a vindication by works that brings your faith to maturity.
That's right. That's right. And all of us should be vindicated before men as we put our faith into practice, so that not only would the believing world see our works and say, well, he's vindicated by his works, he's showing that he is a godly believer, but on top of that, even the unbelieving world, we should have a good reputation. That's one of the qualifications of being an elder, is that you have high regard both in and out of the church.
Well, thank you very much for those thoughts, Bob.
Thanks, Sean.